Hello, good morning. This is the lecture on Han China and the Roman Empire. And I want to make clear, especially if you guys know something about the Roman Empire, especially, or Han China, but you're more people right now are more likely in the United States to know about the Roman Empire. This is just going to be I can't tell you all about the Roman Empire in like basically half a lecture since half of it is Han. We're going to be focusing on some really major themes about this in this lecture, and especially if you're going to be teaching this. I want you to make sure to really read the text very carefully. And even this is a kind of relatively brief thing. I mean, there are whole courses on the Roman Empire, and there could also be whole courses on Han China. And usually, even in global history, as I always say, one of the big strengths of global history is that you get such a wide range of knowledge, and you see connections between things. Like you get to see a connection between Han China and the Roman Empire, which you might not if you were taking either a course just on Chinese history or on the Roman Empire or European history. You see these great connections, which is really interesting. But you learn, you get much less content in either one. So, if anything that really interests you, feel free to read about it. You can even ask me for some suggestions on further reading as well. Okay. So just one big thing to talk about next week's reading and film. The reading is not the textbook. Make sure you look at the reading on Moodle, and also the quiz is going to be on the film Spartacus. So I'm going to ask some questions on Spartacus about the quiz. So you need to read it before next Tuesday. Make sure you do the 1960 film with Kirk Douglas and not the TV series. So yeah, I'll send a message about that as well, just to make sure we're all on the same page and I'll remember this. You can it's about $4 on Amazon Prime, YouTube. There's a bunch of places where you can find Spartacus. If anybody knows how to find it for free, I couldn't find a free one where you could just watch it all the way through on YouTube. So if anybody knows a way to do this, you can let me know. That's going to be the discussion. That's going to be everything. It's going to be focusing on the film and then the two readings. There are two optional readings as well if you're interested in reading more about Spartacus, but I cut the number of readings you have to read. As I've said before, you were going to originally have to write a 5 to 7 page essay on this. Now you do not. Now you don't have to do any. You still have to watch the film, but you just have there's a quiz on it, and there is a response paper, but that's not different than anything else. You don't have to do it if you've already done your response papers. All right, so on. So, yeah, originally I had actually 3 or 4 questions for this week, but because of sort of streamlining this and suddenly putting it online, there's basically one thing that we're going to be talking about, and this is connecting to the forum, the discussion forum as well. The Han and the Roman empires both generated great wealth, but both also had great social inequality. Compare how each empire dealt with social inequality, including the movements from less elite people to have more access to resources. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Again, I think it's most useful when you're dealing with such a huge amount of material just to maybe have one focus. And we're going to be talking in this way about how people see history, how people use history. So that's going to be the focus of this week. So we're going to start with the Han Dynasty. And to talk about the Han Dynasty, you need to understand the Qin Dynasty, which was the first really imperial system. The Qin Dynasty is generally portrayed as a villain, as an evil villain in Chinese history. There was book burning, persecution of Chinese scholars. They talked about that quite a bit in both last chapter and this chapter. They mentioned this. They burned any books they didn't like. They burned Confucian books for as kind of one major example. They wanted anything that wasn't practical. They burned. And so, especially since Chinese scholars like history and the Confucian scholars became popular later, understandably, they condemned the Qin Dynasty. And indeed, there was quite a bit to condemn there. There were horrific punishments, including mutilation, for even relatively minor misdeeds. But there are many things. What's interesting is, even though the Han Dynasty later, and it's generally seen as this evil dynasty, and the Han Dynasty is seen as a really good dynasty, what's interesting is if you look for more of a distance, how many things continued into the Han and later dynasties. The Qin was the first to standardize weights and measurements. That continued. The development of roads continued. They standardized writing. So all the standardization that they did, basically taking something that was much kind of a much more chaotic situation, as we talked about, the Zhou dynasty had basically crumbled into many different kingdoms, into all these civil wars and all this warring, and the Qin brought everything together. So you had a lot of independent kingdoms, and then everybody has to use the same weights and measures, and the development of roads and standardization of writing. And that actually works well enough for people that they don't want to go back to having their own weights and measures or their own kinds of writing. And it was also really important to run an empire. Another big thing you have here is a system of mutual responsibility. And this is still something that you see even in China today. Not exactly in that same form. But basically, there was the idea that you put a group of people together, either one village, sometimes it's 100 families, sometimes it's 10 families. 10 families is usually the lowest level. And if one person does something wrong, then the whole group is punished very severely. And what it's supposed to do is get people to police themselves, because that maybe you wouldn't care if your neighbor's doing something wrong against the state if it wasn't, there, but you know that you're going to be punished for it too. You're going to make sure that they don't do it or report it. So it's one way that the Chinese government governed then. They started Qin dynasty, which continued with the Han dynasty, and they still have some aspects of this in modern China as well. Now, the legal system is interesting. There's the question of should the same punishments be applied regardless of rank or wealth. And this is actually something the Qin dynasty did. They said you're going to get the same punishment, which to us, our current legal system in the United States, that's also what we would say. So that might be something that we'd be more sympathetic to. But from the Han dynasty, where the Confucian idea is that no, it shouldn't be. Like, if a father strikes a son, that's very different than a son striking a father. Whereas perfectly, if you do something wrong, you do something wrong. And then the Han Dynasty, wealthier Confucian scholars actually did have lighter penalties for similar things than basically poorer commoners. And that was seen as appropriate. So some things that changed later, we might actually be more sympathetic to the idea that the same punishment should be applied regardless of rank or wealth, or your status. And then the Han Dynasty, that they actually changed that, so you had a much more unequal, in a way, justice system. This is just one of the standardized Qin coins, just an interesting picture that was in your text that I wanted to draw to. This is a Qin archer, and this isn't the best picture, but I wanted to show that was a clearer picture of the archer, but I wanted to show what it looked like altogether. In Xi'an, and for some reason I can only think of the Chinese name of this right now. Why can't I? The Terracotta Warriors, of course. The Terracotta Warriors is the English name, is what it was known as English, and it's in Xi'an, China. And it's an amazing thing. It actually wasn't discovered until the 1970s. I've seen it actually, but when I was last in China, I wanted to take my kids to see it, but we just didn't have time to get all the way to Xi'an. But it is something spectacular. You see, it's like in this kind of underground thing. You look at it from above. But the Qin, when the Qin emperor died, when you talk about the death of the Qin emperor, it used to be actually in earlier Chinese dynasties they actually sacrificed living people, and so in a way you could look at this as as kind of an improvement. Instead of sacrificing living people, they actually made clay models of a whole huge army that he wanted to bring with him to the afterlife. So no real people were sacrificed, but they had these incredible models of people, and so lifelike. Each face is different, and it's an interesting way to see the clothes that were worn at the time, the weapons. It's really, again, it was found in the 1970s. It's really quite a spectacular find. But the Terracotta Warriors, and that's something to kind of remember if you ever get a chance to see them. If you're ever, visiting China, it's really quite worthwhile. Okay, so the importance of the Han Dynasty is many, many things, but I'm going to give you kind of a rough overview. One, it was one of the most long-lasting dynasties, over 400 years, 206 BCE to 220 CE. And again, you can also say BC. You can also say BC or AD. You might be more familiar with that way of looking at this, but it's again over 400 years. So the word for China, as we talked about, Zhongguo, developed in the Zhou dynasty, and that means central country. And again, that really shows the way the Chinese people saw themselves as the central country, and that continued for, again, thousands of years. That they are the most important country, they are the central country. And they don't, people in modern China wouldn't say this, but even like when you're looking at the 1700s, you'd certainly still see this idea. And everywhere else that wasn't wasn't part of China would be barbarians. But the word Han, and I'm giving you the character there for that, is also important. Chinese language, for example, is called the Hanyu language. So you have Han as becoming really central to the Chinese identity. The majority of the Chinese, 90%, belong with, they call themselves the Han ethnic group. And this is compared to ethnic minorities, for example, Xiangmu. Expanded China, and so the Han Dynasty was one of China. Actually, what you call China actually expands and contracts over the time. But it expanded China to roughly the current boundaries, which is like right now China is the biggest China's ever been. Including Tibet. And there's some things like Tibet that's actually quite controversial because Tibet wasn't always part of China. But now there's a lot of ideas that yes, it is part of China. So that's actually kind of a controversial thing. But at this point, you see it to its basically roughly current boundaries and the broadest boundaries. And the question of who is Chinese, anybody who was under the Chinese government was called Chinese. And the idea of being Chinese involved an idea of civilization. Not everybody was literate. In fact, the majority of people in China are literate, but at this time, like most of the world, most people weren't able to read and write. But the idea among scholars of sharing a common writing system, although not a common language, which I'll get to, was important. An understanding of Confucian ideas became important. And so on the Han Dynasty, that's the other part of this, they established Confucianism as a state ideology. This didn't happen all at once. When you read the later Han, scholars, you'd almost think that, like the next day after the Qin Dynasty fell, the Han Dynasty established Confucianism and all was well and benevolent and peaceful. That was certainly not the case. And in fact, as your textbook says, in the Han Dynasty, regulations the laws weren't that different, weren't all that less cruel or strict than in the Qin Dynasty. That happened over time as Confucians became more powerful. They established a bureaucracy. And that was, again, the most centralized bureaucracy in the world, the biggest bureaucracy in the world. Much more so, as your textbook mentions, than the Roman Empire. And also, when you really see the Han Dynasty, when the idea of what Chinese civilization is developed. The Qin Dynasty started to develop the script that was all the same, a kind of a common script. But the Han Dynasty really developed the writings and the commentaries on Confucianism that are seen as really an important part of civilization. And in China, basically, if you understood the kind of dominant state ideology of Confucianism, the extent to which you accepted that part of Chinese culture, you were civilized. And the people who didn't, like the Xiangmu, who were people who were kind of nomadic people nearby, the nomadic people nearby were not civilized, and therefore were really not Chinese. There were people who were the closer you were to China, like Japan and Korea, the elites practiced a lot of Confucian ideas. And they would call them cooked barbarians. And then everybody else, the further you were from Chinese culture, you would be called raw barbarians. They weren't familiar with Europeans at this time, but they certainly would have thought of them as very, very raw barbarians if they were, but they didn't have enough connection with them. There wasn't usually direct, the Chinese and the Roman Empire, over the Silk Roads, various Silk Roads, they influenced each other to some extent, but they didn't directly engage with each other very much, the Chinese and the Roman empires. Okay, so again, these are you can look and see these are the boundaries. You can see the Han Dynasty grow if you look at the various colors. I don't think I can show you my I don't think you can see my my arrow wiggling, so it's hard to do this. But just look at, basically pay attention to this map and pay attention to how the Han Dynasty grew over time. And then you have the first century. You have the Pax Sinica, which I'm going to talk about more kind of the idea of this kind of this kind of peace that Chinese did, a really big empire. That's one thing that a really big empire, you don't always have as much, thought or freedom, but you do have relative peace, and you can really contrast this, for example, to the Warring States period beforehand. In a way, this was the Confucian goal, to have one really strong empire that would keep peace over a large area. Okay, this switched more quickly than I wanted to, but it's okay. Chinese writing is the only, I've talked about this before, I'm just going to give you a quick kind of review of this. One of your actually essay questions for the midterm talked about this. It was the only fully based character-based system. Japanese and Korean partially use Chinese characters with different pronunciations, but they also have their own alphabetic script as well. And this was, if you look at the huge area that was ruled by the Han Dynasty, and that's ruled by the Chinese kingdom at its largest, or the Chinese empire at its largest, you really see how important this is, because again, before modern times, oral language tended to change pretty quickly, and even now, if like someone from Sichuan, like from Western China, was talking to someone from Beijing, and they were, or let's say someone from, some, Dalian, because Beijing is the script that most people understand, the language that most people understand. Let's say somebody from Western China was talking to someone from Shanghai, Eastern China, and they're talking in their own dialects. They wouldn't even today be able to understand each other. But now there's like a main oral language called Putonghua. Everybody speaks like the main standardized Chinese usually, and then people also speak their own dialects now. But at the time, most, especially the less educated peasants, would usually only speak their own dialects. But there was a common written language, and so no matter where you were, you would be able to read the Chinese characters, and you don't need to know the pronunciation of the characters to be able to read them. I went over this in class as well. If you see the character, you know what it means, and it's not related to pronunciation. Now again, the disadvantage was literacy was much, much harder to achieve, because you have to learn to really even be moderately literate in Chinese. You have to know 2,000 characters, and to be fully literate, it's more like 5,000 characters. But the disadvantage of an alphabetic script is that it doesn't work well for language. Now, Latin, and we're talking about the Roman Empire, Latin became enough of a main language that most people would speak Latin also according to in addition to their own language. So that would be another kind of solution to this, having a kind of broad area. But the Chinese did this, and the Chinese did this, it is the oldest, like the Roman Empire stopped, and the Han Dynasty still, even though the dynasty stopped and there was another, there were other dynasties later on, you still have China. You still have kind of a kind of coherent kind of cultural entity that has survived up to the current day. And it's really the only time this has happened. So in the script they use was actually an important part of this. Okay, so the most centralized bureaucracy in the world at the time. Qin fell because of the rebellion of aristocrats, also common people, but the aristocrats started this. The Han Dynasty originally had to give the aristocrats some autonomy, but it changed into the most centralized bureaucracy in the world. So it changed into the bureaucracy where the emperor and the basic central power had the most power. All males registered, paid taxes, served in the military. That was a legacy from the Qin Dynasty, but the Qin Dynasty was too short to have this be as influential. In 136 BCE, you have an imperial university. This was really important in spreading Confucianism. 30,000 students, absolutely the largest university in the world. So Han, as I've said before, so Confucianism is a state ideology. Han emphasized that the Qin cruelty when discussing the mandate of heaven. The Qin lost it because they were so cruel. But there wasn't, as I said before, not a quick embrace of Confucianism right away. There were many remnants of legalism. And the Imperial University was really important for this elite embrace of Confucianism. An idea of a mutual obligation between the rulers and subjects. So the subjects were supposed to obey, but the rulers were supposed to take care of them. And this wasn't democracy, but it was the idea that the ruler was supposed to serve the people, was supposed to take care of the people. We'll see that this didn't always happen, and this is when we talk about inequality more. But Chinese scholars became very important. And you see a kind of bargain here. Scholars are more important in China, in traditional China, than they were in almost any other area in the world. It's something that really makes China distinguished, and you really see this in the Han Dynasty. You have a kind of bargain where the Chinese scholars will write and legitimize Han rule, and the Han would support Chinese scholars. And you see this with later dynasties as well. And so you see the growing importance of scholar officials. This is Emperor Wu. I'm not going to get into him as much, but Wu Di was a really important empire in expanding China. And this is a picture of him that's in, I believe, in your text as well that I wanted to focus on. Han entertainment became very famous as well. This is looking at the acrobats, and this is actually when the Chinese acrobatic tradition is established. If this were a lecture, I actually had this really beautiful example of Chinese acrobatics to show you. This sort of to break up the lecture a bit, because it was originally going to be like one day of Han and one day of the Roman Empire. And I put that online. You don't have to look at it, but it's definitely kind of worth seeing. One big important distinction, as your text said, is that, and I put this in your quiz as well, is that we're going to talk about the Roman Empire, how important the entertainment was in kind of ruling and pacifying people, and in some ways addressing inequality. You don't have that quite. You do have street people who perform for other people for money, but the government doesn't sponsor at this point broad entertainment to entertain the masses. That wasn't something that the Chinese government ever thought they had to do, was entertain the masses. So you had beautiful art forms developing, and you had street performers, and you had elite performance for elite, but the elite never sponsored performances for the masses. And we're going to talk about how the Roman Empire. This is what a Chinese model of a Han house looks like. So Han, peace in prosperity. But there was a darker side to this, as we'll see. The Silk Road brought prosperity. We talked about the Silk Road last week as well. The largest military in the world, you had 100,000 in active service and 1 million in standing army. The Rome has 30,000 active and its largest 250,000 standing army. So the Han Dynasty is, again, the largest military state. You had a lot of bloodshed, a lot of infighting, but out of that bloodshed, and you'll see something similar in Rome. The Pax Romana you might be more familiar with, but this is the Pax Sinica. It's from 149 to 87 BCE, so you can see it's an earlier period than what you call the Pax Romana. You had peace, rising standards of living. The Xiongnu were, again, I talked about this. There was conflict with the Xiongnu sometimes, but there was also they were also really important, and we talked about this before about how important the nomadic people. Yeah, the Xiongnu, as your text says, was a nomadic people who lived on the borders of them, and they were not considered civilized by the Chinese, but they were nonetheless very important in helping trade. The nomadic people continued to be really important in trade, and you definitely see this here. So they helped the Silk Road, and they helped bring prosperity. But at the same time, you had this peace and prosperity coming in through the Silk Road, because everybody, I just want to emphasize this, that everybody wanted Chinese silk. Chinese silk was one of the most beautiful and valuable commodities in the world. Everybody wanted it. Again, the Silk Road wasn't one smooth road where you would just sort of zip over from China to Rome, but there were a lot of small travel routes, and in the end, China and Rome to some extent were connected by this, but not in one big smooth road. So you had prosperity, you had everybody wanting to buy silk and other Chinese goods, and that brought a lot of money into the Chinese Empire. But at the same time, as population expanded, you had more deforestation. You had huge numbers, as your text says, the Chinese scholars loved to draw trees, but the Chinese farmers would cut down trees. And with this deforestation, you had increased flooding, so you had problems that way. This huge military was very expensive. So you never had slavery in Han China the way you did in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was almost built on slavery. And next week, the Spartacus, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. But you did have this issue of free peasants losing their land here because of an inability to pay taxes. So this huge military did burden the free peasants. Again, free peasants were the backbone of the Chinese Empire, much more. So the free peasants losing land really did cause us something of a social crisis in the Han Dynasty. And this brings us to Wang Meng, who is a fascinating historical figure, very debated. Was he an evil usurper, as he was discussed in most Han Dynasty, or was he a tragic hero? So, I'll just tell you a little bit about him. He was originally a regent for a child emperor, and then he took power for himself from 9 to 23 CE. And this is seen as kind of well, it's not seen as, it was a break between the early Han Dynasty and the later Han Dynasty. Was this period from 9 to 23 CE? You could also say AD on that as well. You have to understand the time. So you had natural disasters, more power of landlords, and then you had increased taxes, and the landlords were powerful enough that they didn't have to pay the taxes, so more of the taxes were falling on the poorest peasants. And peasants were losing land, and they were becoming tenants of the landlords. So instead of having their own land, they were dependent on the landlords. And then the landlords had more and more power. And the more power they had, the less taxes they wanted to pay for themselves. And so society was falling apart at this point. And so Wang Meng steps in, and he is a very respected Confucian scholar. He was very close to the Han Empire. In fact, his family was part of the actually Han Dynasty. Just he was related to some people in the Han ruling family, which is why he was the regent for the child emperor. He was again seen as a very upright person. He ruled from 9 to 23 to CE. 9 CE to 23 CE. And he tried to redistribute land, and he confiscated gold from wealthy landowners to do this. And he also introduced new coins and fought more with the Xiongnu. So the first thing you would think would make him really popular were the peasants. And this is again how the Chinese Communist Party came into power, by redistributing land. Confiscating gold from the wealthy landowners. The current Chinese Communist government, which was started in 1949. Again, he also introduced new coins and fought more with the Xiongnu. The new coins were something that threw chaos into the economic system, which hurt everybody. He did his reforms very quickly, and his struggles with the Xiongnu, his greater military struggles, also brought more hardship. All that might have been okay in the end, and he might have been able to have an empire, except for something that happened 2 years after he started ruling, was the Yellow River changed course. It has done this like numerous times throughout Chinese history, and so basically it's on one course, and then it changes course. And in changing the course, which isn't really his fault, he couldn't have controlled this, but it brought huge famine. It's like literally millions and millions of people are killed and drowned, and I mean just like so much farmland is taken out of circulation. It's hard to describe what a horrible natural disaster this is. Now, according to Chinese thought, when you have a horrible natural disaster, that's because the ruler doesn't have enough virtue. So this hurt him psychologically, but it also gave him an unprecedented disaster to deal with. You have at this point a Taoist rebellion with the red eyebrows. Now, you might think of Taoists as people, when I taught you about Taoism before, it's like, why would you rebel? It's about kind of going with the flow and basically accepting things and loving nature. But at this point, Taoism had become a religion as well. I'm going to talk more about that. And it was something that it gathered together a lot of poor people, and the poor people kind of used the gathering together and this kind of the supernatural power that was supposed to come from Taoism to have this idea of rebellion. So it wasn't that Taoist philosophy necessarily made people rebel, but you had these groups of Taoist secret societies where people would get together, and that formed an idea when things were going really badly of rebelling. So he actually had to deal with a lot of peasant rebellion, peasants who saw him as a ruler that had brought disaster to so many people and brought starvation, even though you could argue that the Yellow River changing course wasn't his fault. This happened, and he was trying to help redistribute land and help make a more equal system, which you would have thought would have gotten him support. But in part because of the Yellow River changing course, and in part because a lot of his economic reforms were kind of chaotic and did cause economic chaos. He didn't just redistribute land. And in part because, of course, the landowners hated him as well, and they had civil power, and they wouldn't always really do the land reforms as well. He tried to do a lot very quickly, So this is a big debate about him, who he is. Now, of course, in later Han sources, when the Han Dynasty came back, they portrayed him as an evil usurper, and the fact that the Yellow River changed course was shown how much heaven hated him. He's currently portrayed as a hero, not surprisingly, in the communist government, because, again, the redistribution of land, they can actually kind of come back here, so he's seen more as in heroic terms now. It's interesting because you hear a lot about this issue of, basically, you can learn from history. But people tend to shape history or write history in a way that supports whatever their particular view is on things. So when you say learning from history, it's more like you can look and see how people are viewing history, what they're trying to prove at the time. People who are more sympathetic to land redistribution would say that Wang Mang actually was a noble person and had good ideas, but he was defeated by a civil service that wouldn't work with him. That he actually didn't pursue. He actually should have been focusing more just on land reform and not on fighting with the Xiongnu. So then you could just say that the idea was good, but it was badly executed. People who are against sudden social change would say that he tried to change everything so quickly and he ruined everything. And this is why everybody rebelled against him. So, yeah. It's okay. I'm going to have to stop for just a second. And, hold on. I don't actually know how to stop. Alright, sorry guys. Here we go. Okay, I don't know how to do this and not lose everything I just did, so I'm just gonna go on. Okay, later Han, in the end of the dynasty, it was a much less powerful dynasty after this. Flourishing trade brought wealth, but landowners actually kept having more power, they paid less taxes, and there was a heavier burden on the poor peasants, they lost land. The Taoist red eyebrows continued. Just so you know, they're called the red eyebrows. People ask why they were called this. I don't think your text goes into this. When they were fighting when they were fighting the government troops, they were afraid they wouldn't be able to tell who they were and who other people were in this, and so they painted their eyebrows red so they would know, like they basically, so they wouldn't do very much on friendly fire. And the yellow turbans came after this. They were both groups that came out of Taoist secret societies. The poor would get together to worship and have basically supernatural ideas. At this point, Lao Tzu was seen as a god. In the original Taoist idea, Lao Tzu was not a god. He was a philosopher. But at this point, you're seeing more of a kind of traditional religion with a lot of gods and spirits and people getting together. There was an idea of kind of like the Taoist red eyebrows actually had strong standards of not killing peasants, which the government troops unfortunately did not always have, like as far as killing civilians. Also not plundering and taking things from civilians. So in a way, they actually had more popular support than the government troops as well. But you had more and more of these peasant rebellions. And in the end, the Han Dynasty was basically couldn't basically survive this. And three dynasties replaced the Han: the Wei, the Shu, and the Wu. And you didn't have a really big unifying Chinese dynasty again until the Tang Dynasty, about another 400 years later after this, after the defeat of the Han Dynasty. But you can see this, and one way of looking at the Han Dynasty is this growing inequality, the failure of Wang Mang reforms that brought the Han Dynasty back not temporarily, actually for another 200 years. But they were never able to really solve the problem of inequality. And the landowners, they kept getting wealthier and not being willing to pay the taxes. So basically, the wealthier the landowners got, in a way, the central government could never actually rein them in enough to be able to actually support and help the peasants, and that's why the peasants rebelled, and that's why you had chaos, and that's why the dynasty fell down. That's one way of looking at the end of the Han Dynasty. Okay, women in the Han Dynasty. Wealthy women were in the inner quarters, but inner quarters meant that they didn't. It wasn't they were never allowed out. They could go out for boat rides and for painting parties, but they weren't allowed to freely mix elite women in society. So they couldn't just go to the market. But wealthier women did have access to education. As your text says, you have Ban Zhao, a famous woman scholar. He wrote the history of the Han Dynasty and also lessons for women. And she wrote about very strict rules of conduct. The question is, and it made it sound like women had very, very strict rules, and people would just read this and say, wow, Chinese women weren't allowed to do anything. What's interesting is the question of how strictly followed they were, and why do people make rules? And this is an important concept for all sources about women, as I say in big capital letters here. People only make rules for things that are actual problems. So, if, for example, people say that women should be quiet and peaceful, which was one of the rules, and not engage in arguments and jealousy in the inner quarters, that was because women, a lot of times, didn't always listen. If there's a lot of rules about how women have to listen to their husbands and follow what their husbands say, and that's emphasized over and over, that's because women didn't always follow what their husbands have to say. So if something is already happening, you don't have to make a rule about it. So if people write a lot about something, that means that it's a problem. People aren't doing it. So women didn't always listen to their husbands. Women didn't always follow their husbands in this. So the important of women were very important as managers of households. Older people under Confucianism had more power than younger people, and that included women. An older woman would often have a lot of power in running the household. Now, less elite women, poorer women, were less protected. They also had more freedom. Poorer women would sometimes work in the fields. They would join troops of dancing girls, for example. So again, it was really the elite. The more elite you were, the less freedom you had as far as being able to go outside. Of course, the more food you had and other good things that come from being, of a more elite status. But the poor women did tend to have much more freedom than more elite women. So where you were as far as women go depends on where you were in the class structure as well. Okay, the Roman Empire. So this map, again, it's harder to show because I can't really show I can't show you things on the map with my cursor, with my little arrow thing. But just pay attention here to where and how Rome grew. This shows you, the great growth of the Roman Empire. Again, one of the great global massive empires of the world history. It began in an Italian peninsula, Latinum, one of many city-states. Now, what's really interesting is from 450 to 250 BCE, the Gallic migrations into northern Italy removed the main competitor to Rome. So the most powerful people at the time were the Etruscans. Etruscans. I'm sorry, the Etruscans. Yeah, the Etruscans. They were the most powerful people at the time. And the Gallic migrations into northern Italy actually removed them, and that sort of opened a space for the people who became the Romans to come in. So Romans had a lot of military efficiency and manpower. By 265 CE, they controlled the Italian peninsula. So basically, I'm sorry. That should be BCE. I knew that was wrong. At 265 BCE, they controlled the Italian peninsula. That should be BCE, not CE on there. 3 Punic Wars defeated Carthage. That was 264 to 1646 BCE. Defeated and destroyed Carthage. The big famous thing is Hannibal and the elephants here that you see come in. I'm going to just let you read about that just because of time constraints here. I'm trying to get both the Han and the Roman Empire, but it's an important thing. Certainly, if you're going to teach this, if you're an history education major, you should really make sure you've read carefully about these 3 Punic Wars. And whole books, and you could teach a course just on these Punic Wars. In the end, Carthage was destroyed, and the Romans killed the adult males and sold the women and children into slavery. Slavery was a very big thing there. You have the 50s BCE, you have Julius Caesar in Gaul, which is the France and the Rhine now, killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million. So Roman expansion was a brutal process. This is a picture of Hannibal's elephants, the famous elephants of Carthage. In the end, it's almost a classic example. He was actually able to defeat the Romans. Hannibal was a brilliant strategist, military strategist. But in the end, the Roman Empire was just too big a force for him to go under. So in the end, Carthage was defeated. It was really kind of a classic case of being able to win a lot of battles but losing the war. A very strong military ethic in Rome. Universal conscription of adult males. Military service could be up to 10 years. Now, there was rigorous training with the death penalty for infractions. This is the word decimation where it comes from. You might have heard of the idea of decimate. Oh, they just decimated something. So, and this is, again, you see an interesting connection with the Han Dynasty. If a unit committed an infraction, and this was a way of getting people to police each other too, 1 in every 10 men could be killed. So just randomly, and you could be that person. And it did actually ensure compliance and basically good behavior and loyalty. Not necessarily good behavior, but behavior that would please the ruling class here. But there were also, despite this, there were strong bonds between commanders and troops. So you see this idea that commanders could actually literally kill every 10th person in his troop. They didn't try. Obviously, that was something that was an extreme thing. That wasn't something that happened on a very regular basis because you would literally decimate your troops. And there were also strong bonds of caring and loyalty between commanders and troops, which would become very important, especially later on in Rome. So, republic, our word republic today, which we know, comes from the Latin res publica, which means this public thing. And you had the Senate, which we have today. So Rome, in this way, has been very influential. In fact, not just accidentally influential, but when the founding fathers were trying to discover this idea of a new democracy and a republic, they actually wanted more of a republic than a democracy, especially originally. And they looked toward the ideas of Rome. They looked at the idea of the senates. The idea that there's a senate which is more elite, and a representation of representative of the plebeian. The word plebeian today still means kind of common. It's seen as kind of an insult, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And you see that the plebes have a connection to the House of Representatives, whereas the Senate is actually literally the Senate. So you see the connection with U.S. institutions today. This is some of the long-term influence of the Roman Empire. There's the idea of dicta as law in Latin, and this led to you could have a dictator when things got really out of control. There could be somebody who had complete power, but it was only supposed to be up to 6 months. As we'll see, this changed when Rome changed from being a republic to an empire, and then the Roman empires had complete power. So, growing inequality in Rome. Military triumphs brought slaves. You had more and more slaves. We talked about the enslaving of 1 million people in Gaul, so a lot of foreign people were enslaved. They came there and they displaced the free farmers. Originally, like China, you had a lot of small peasants. And this changed over time to when you had all these slaves, the poor peasants lost their land and actually went to Rome to urban areas. You had this, what you call urbanization, more people going to urban areas. Now, you had a kind of, even though it was later, you had a kind of counterpart. Wang Meng was later. You can see a counterpart to this in the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. And they attempted to redistribute the lands of the wealthy. Again, much like Wang Mang. And like Wang Mang, they both meant ends where Wang Mang was killed in battle when people were, when the peasants, people, and the rebels stormed his palace and he was slaughtered by them. And the same thing, the same thing actually, both the Gracchi brothers, 10 years apart actually, but their both attempts to redistribute land ended in them being killed more by wealthy elite. Actually, Gaius committed suicide when he knew he was going to be killed, and a lot of their followers were slaughtered as well. For them, they didn't have a big natural disaster like Wang Mang did, so it's not an exact parallel. But the redistributing lands is actually a good kind of connection between both of them, and what happened, how that failed, the kind of resistance to that. For Gaius, especially the younger brother, who was killed in 121 BCE, and as you'll see, Tiberius was killed in 133 BCE, the proposal to extend citizenship to non-Romans actually hurt his support among poor peasants. This is something your text doesn't go into as much, but it's kind of interesting. He actually said that if we extend citizenship to non-Romans, to some extent, that would actually help with inequality. He believed in giving them land as well and helping them. And actually, a lot of the poor Roman peasants, even though they were very poor, they were very proud of the Roman citizenship. So the idea of helping foreigners or bringing foreigners into their fold and making them citizens was actually quite unpopular. So that actually did hurt his popular support. Although they did have, and Gaius even more than Tiberius, they did have a good bit of popular support. They were hoping that in the end, that they would be able to command enough popular support. This is what they call kind of populism, that they would be popular enough that the reforms would be able to go through. This was not the case with either of them. So after the failure of these reforms, poor peasants turned to generals for relief. You have the growing strength of the military in Rome. The poor peasants basically realized or believed that they would not be able to get relief or help from the Senate. So it became more of a relationship with the military, and because of all this loyalty, the military grew more and more powerful. The Senate grew weaker, and the military no longer had to listen to the Senate. And people trace this to some extent to the failure of these land reforms. That the Senate basically couldn't help them. And so then you have civil wars, very destructive civil wars from 90 BC to 30 BC. All right, hopefully this will still work. Okay, aqueducts and roads. So then you have basically emperors, which were seen as very positive, and kings were seen as very negative. You see the army being transformed from citizen volunteers to a professional army during this time. The governors of the provinces were appointed by emperor, their lower level officials. But again, much less administration than the Han Dynasty. Slaves could actually become very elite, and the elite slaves who could read and write were became part of administration. So you might have an elite slave that had a lot more money and comfort, even though they didn't have the same citizen rights as a poor Roman peasant, for example. You started having more and more private companies for tax collection, and that actually led to a conflict of interest, where the private companies had an interest in collecting as much tax as possible and being able to keep more for themselves. That led to more exploitation of the peasants, a kind of a conflict of interest, whereas when the government collects their own taxes, they want to keep things peaceful. They have more of a long-term interest, whereas private companies for tax collection don't have that same long-term interest. They're more interested in just getting as much money as they can right away. At the same time, as far as the equality goes, you're having more and more inequality, but you also have a legal system that offers more access to the courts than ever before. Okay. Now this is pretty important, and a really important difference with the Han Dynasty. You have amphitheaters, you have the Colosseum. Amazing. So as I said before, the Han Dynasty, there was entertainment, there were acrobats, and some of them did perform for street people, some of them performed for elite people, but the elite people never had sponsored these amazing public entertainments. And you do see that the Roman Empire doing this. So huge amphitheaters. You have the Colosseum, which you might have heard of the Colosseums because other later on, even now in the United States, people have these huge theaters and call it the Colosseum. You had these exotic animals were shown, naval battles, gladiator contests, which we'll talk more about next week with Spartacus. Again, that's an important contrast with the Han Dynasty. The idea of being a citizen of Rome you didn't have that same concept of citizenship in the Han Dynasty. And again, this was a very important legacy. And you had personal relationships, what they call a patron and a client. And these are still words that you use today. A patron is a wealthy person who literally patronizes. And that's seen as a negative word too. If you're patronizing someone, you're being condescending. But it didn't originally have this meaning. If you're a patron, like a patron of the arts, will support the arts. And the clients were the people who supported them. So when you look at these patron-clients relationships, that was another thing. A personal relationship might, even though there was more and more inequality, if you could find a patron, a wealthy person to help you, that would help this, and that helped mitigate this inequality. There's a phrase I want you to be familiar with, because it's a phrase you might come across. It's called bread and circuses. And it's still used in political discourses a lot. The Roman Empire also, to everybody who lived in Rome, this is kind of to kind of help with inequality, they gave out bread. So they would give out a certain thing of bread, and later on they would actually even give out meat. So they would give enough food to people in Rome that they wouldn't rebel, that they would see themselves as part of this. And they also had massive entertainment for them. So they had circuses and exotic animals and gladiator contests and all these other things, but also massive circuses. And it's a way of basically pacifying people, giving them enough that they're satisfied with the social order without really making any change or really helping them really better themselves. Because if you were a poor Roman peasant, or if you were a poor Roman, if you were someone who lived in Rome and didn't have any land, so you even weren't a peasant, and you had enough to eat, you knew you could count on these regular giving of bread and meat, just enough to kind of keep you alive and to eat, and you'd had also these entertainments. The idea is you'd be pacified. So when people say bread and circuses today, they mean like small programs that keep people pacified but don't really challenge the social order and don't really challenge like basically the basic inequality of wealth. So where the Gracchi reforms, which actually talked about land reform and real social change, was very threatening, the bread and circuses idea of giving people every Roman citizen got a certain amount of bread, and then later on that actually even expanded to getting some meat from the state, giving people enough to keeping them pacified. It's basically a critical term. Nobody would say my own policy is bread and circuses. It's something that people use to criticize other policies. But it's again a useful thing for you to know whether or not you're going to be a history here of that. These are just some cool pictures from your text. I want you to pay attention to. This is a Roman town. This is a picture of an aqueduct, which is another. This is actually the aqueduct. And so family life and gender, another thing to compare. Originally I had you write something. This was one of the potential exam questions. I'm taking it off now and just having you focus on one, but it's important to know. The family was the basic unit of governance in the Roman Empire. That was the basis for the kind of the census, which is still not still what we use today, what we use again today. That was an influence from Rome. So you had, if you've heard of paternalism, or paterfamilias was the head of the family in Rome, and there would be a male head of the family. And there were laws enforcing the male heads of the families. But as in China, there are other sources that show that women bought and sold property without male permission. So you had these laws and these legal ideas that women were supposed to be subordinate to men, but then if you look at what actually happened, it was much more complex, and that tends to happen. There was education for women. And again, you see a difference. This is a useful thing to kind of look at, is the difference between prescriptive versus descriptive sources. Prescriptive sources are sources that tell what should happen and what laws want to happen, and descriptive sources were things that tended to talk about what actually did happen more. Pollution in Rome. Rome, as your text says, was the first global polluter. You see ice samples from the Mediterranean Sea, ice sheets from Greenland. You can see even examples of that pollution. So basically, people going back, now that environmental history is a thing, this wasn't something that interested people talking about Rome earlier, but now with a new field of environmental history, people are looking, and they're talking more about the environmental consequences of this huge empire. So we talked about the Han Dynasty deforestation, and then the pollution in Rome as well. Okay, my last slide, barbarians and slaves. Now, people on the outskirts of Roman Empire were literally called barbarians. I've actually said that Chinese people considered them barbarians. Of course, they didn't use that word. They used other words in Chinese. But the literal word barbarian came from the Roman Empire. The idea was that the languages they spoke were just barbar, like the kind of goofy languages. And so they became important sources of slaves and also mercenaries for the Roman. As you stopped having citizens, basically before this, you would actually be able to have even poor Roman peasants would actually serve in the army. That could be a way of social mobility. Now losing land, they didn't anymore. So the Roman Empire became more dependent on mercenaries. A lot of times they were foreign mercenaries, and also slaves. So at this time, you had the Goths and the Germans were a main part of this, and again considered literal barbarians, and they were non-literal agricultural communities. But yet, the Roman Empire became more and more dependent on them, and then, as you write in your text, they became very crucial to the eventual destruction of the Roman Empire. Okay, I wish I could ask for questions. I wish I could go. I've kind of smushed these two things together. But feel free to email me any questions if there's anything you'd like me to go over more. Okay, thank you. I'll be writing to you. I'm going to post this right now because I wanted to get this posted by this morning. Okay, thank you.